Episode 20 of the Sumer Sports Show. Welcome, everybody. We're a little late to go, but I promise you it's for good reasons and very exciting reasons for my co-host, Thomas Dimitroff, the CEO of Sumer Sports. I'm Eric Eager. I'm the VP of Research and Development at Sumer Sports. We're a day late today. Even we're a little bit late to the jump here, but again, really fun things. Specifically for me, I got to hang out with one Thomas Dimitroff basically for 2 straight days. And I got to say, it's worth it to me for having this show be on a Thursday instead of a Wednesday. Just a programming note, we are going to go back to Wednesdays next week. But, Thomas, how you doing?
Man, I'm doing well. It's an exciting night. There's a couple things to talk about. I think first you need to tell a quick story about Gersh, one of our new engineers, talking about the difference between your size and my size. I'm going to close this door while you start that discussion.
Okay.
It's a funny story.
Yeah, I mean, so it's funny because Gersh is one of our new engineers. And in fact, when he learned of being able to work at Sumer Sports, one of his friends said he was a listener to my old podcast, the PF Forecast. A lot of you have referenced that in comments for this show. And so we already had it's funny, but we already had a fan of our podcast and of our company before he even joined. And then the most surprising one was he thought that you were the tall one of the two of us, and I was the short one. And okay, so let's examine this here for the people that are watching on YouTube. I know for podcasters, it's great podcasting. By the way, Zach came in. He was waiting in the waiting room before. He says, hello, Zach. We really appreciate you coming on here. One of our loyal listeners, of course. But yeah, I mean, so let's examine this here. Thomas, you do lean in a little bit more than I do. But I feel like if you look at if you look at like the overall size of things, so this is my 1994 Minnesota Vikings signed football. Like, I feel like you can get this idea that, like, I got big hands. Like, I'm a 6'3" guy right here. And not just, but maybe it's just the fact that I sit away because, I've been trying to lose a little bit of weight. I've been trying to look thin on camera. I don't know. But that was a very humorous occasion there. And a funny one. And we have, it's the podcast audience has grown so much. It's been so fun to be able to share this with you guys.
Well, look, just so everyone knows, let's get to the basics. I've always been really particular about what a scout's tape is truly talking about from a height standpoint. And I've always called myself 5'9", 175, 65, depending on if I'm biking a lot. So let's just call me 5'9". On a scout's tape from Kevin Colbert back in the day when I worked for the Detroit Lions, I was 5'8 3/4, man. I jumped it up to 5'9". Our guy here is 6'3", very different phenotypically. He and I are very different. However, it was kind of funny that people had assumed that. So I don't know what it is. It's just life is funny that way. I hated to disappoint Gersh. It was almost like he was disappointed. And I was thinking, well, that's not good.
I don't know. You always covet the thing you don't have. Right. And so I, of course, as a tall, lanky thing growing up. And then, now that I'm a little bit bigger, I got big to play tight end in college. And it hasn't always been the easiest for me to keep weight off. I admire, of course, how fit you are. But of course, somebody who's, not on the taller side, but on the fit side might be like, oh, I would have loved to have, I could have done wonders with a 6'3", 240-pound body, you oaf. So I think that there's two sides of it. You always covet what you don't have. So I thought that was funny, and it was really fun, to get to Florida and get to talk to. I'm amazed always, and I give some people their flowers here. I'm amazed always at how intelligent the people we have at Sumer, and obviously he announced this earlier. We weren't even able to have Parker Fleming and Tage Seth come because they joined us recently. Actually, in fact, Parker and his wife had a baby this week, so. That is really, really fun. But with the people that we were able to just talk football with, it's so incredible. It's the amount of insights we get. I mean, the things that some of our guys, the Udit Ranazarias and the Pavel Babashevitz are able to do with tracking data, or, just like the wealth of knowledge that Paul Saban has. Sean, of course, with his stint with 2 NFL teams, and obviously being able to go back and forth with you. I know we had a tense moment about wide receiver 1 through wide receiver 3, which is kind of cool given, how much success you had at drafting that whole spectrum. So whenever I come back from those, I'm always so energized by who I get to interact with on a daily basis.
Yeah, you're exactly right, brother. It was really good being there. And that in essence is what we are also going to talk about very quickly before we move into a lot of coaching and other stuff. Tonight, we got confirmation from our fearless founder and chairman, Paul Tudor Jones. That's why we have financial TV up on here in the spirit of Paul. He confirmed tonight that we truly can move forward and open an office in Atlanta. And I am so excited about that. You know that. I think it's great for not only the people that are going to be living and moving to Atlanta, but having an office in Atlanta, as well as our headquarters will always be in Palm Beach, because that's where Mr. Jones and Jack, our COO and co-founder, is. We're going to have some really good stuff going on in Atlanta. Will be a lot more accessible. We can eventually talk about this, and we won't bring it up here right now. I don't want 90,000 people lined up at our door, but believe me, Atlanta's got a really good hotspot for us to connect with people. We're talking about really digging in on the potential Georgia Tech and Kennesaw State element of intern programs. There's some really good stuff in Atlanta. Not only that is the opportunity, as we ever do go into a B2C situation, we think Atlanta is ideal. We have to get Eric here sooner than later. I won't go into that, let you talk about that. But in the end, really, really excited about the development of this company. And part of growing like this makes it even that much more exciting for everyone that was at our offsite recently.
Yeah, for sure. There's just a couple. You said it so eloquently. I hate to even spring this joke, but the only reason Paul watches the show is so he can watch his TV behind you. That's the one stipulation. He said, look, you guys can have a podcast, but Thomas has to have Emmett or what is it, CNBC on in the background so that I can watch the ticker while you guys talk. No, it's just a joke. But by the way, we already have some interest here. We have Dan Bodine. I am a Georgia Tech student. Well, we will be talking to you, but and it's so great. Like this community that we've built, not only at Sumer but in the sports analytics world in general. What we want to build with this podcast, we want this to be a place where we talk about the latest and greatest ideas in this space, and it'll be so cool to be able to interact with everybody on a day-to-day basis. Surely, drive the conversation forward. And I, just thinking about some of the things that we were talking about this morning, about coaching and just, what are these teams looking for in general? And that's kind of the topic that I wanted to bring up early. It's clear to me, obviously, that there's still a ton of meat left on the bone in both directions, right? There's the analytics, like the folks like me, I think we have to derive better metrics to study and evaluate coaching. There's no doubt about it. I think we've made worlds of advancement. In fact, the Hidden Game of Football came out with its second edition the other day. And that, in the 80s, they talked about coaching decisions in that book for the first time, really in a formal way. And then, of course, I think we have to be able to communicate better to folks who have hired coaches the same way forever. That to me is there's such a gap that we can collectively bridge, because right now, teams are going through, and I want to, just kind of give people an idea of where the landscape is. Arizona needs a new GM and a new head coach. They're the only franchise right now for which that's true. Indianapolis needs a new coach. Houston needs a new coach. Carolina presumably needs a new coach. They haven't talked about Steve Wilkes in that way yet. Denver needs a new coach. And, not to speak too early, but there is a chance that Los Angeles with the Rams with McVay might end up needing a new coach. That has not been confirmed. I do not have any inside information or anything. There have just been a much speculation there. But to even think about where this goes, Thomas, you have such a diverse group of teams needing coaches that there is not going to be a one-size-fits-all recommendation for every single team here.
So this is a perfect segue into talking about coaching selection. how incredibly multi-layered it is, how difficult it is, and all of the listeners and all the followers who understand or have an idea about football, how important it is to make sure that there is a relationship between a general manager and a head coach. It's much bigger than just play calling, game management. There are so many layers, and you and I have been talking about this for years right now, and we're really honed in on it right now. I'd love to spend a little bit of time talking about it from the perspective of you have the stats behind this, so I'd love for you to riff on this. But where the numbers are right now, the mistakes, respectfully, I'm not in any way taking shots, of course, at ownership. The reality in the NFL right now is we need to improve. I say we formally. It's really important that the league is doing a more adept job in bringing together those coaches with the general managers who are going to build teams together. And there's not going to be this turnover as regular as it is. That's a lot of money. You have the stats on that. Riff a little bit on the money out there first before we get going on this, because this is vital.
I mean, it's crucial. I mean, Matt Rule, the thing, I'm going to bring this back a little bit to two coaches that kind of give rise to the same problem, right? And they're not bad men. In fact, Matt Rule is a coach now at my alma mater, Nebraska. But, the Panthers gave Matt Rule a very, very generous contract because they were afraid that he was going to interview with the Giants.
An APY of $7.8 million in his first go-around.
Yeah, and a 6-year deal as well, right? I believe a 6-year deal. And so, the problem is, of course, when that doesn't work out, then you're on the hook for all that money unless the guy can get another job, and then there's offset money. But then that creates another thing where Nebraska's got to give him what it was an 8 or 10-year deal just to make it worth his while, because they got to give him new money on top of the stuff he's making in Carolina. Mm-hmm. I remember in 2006 when I was in college living in Minnesota, the Vikings had just fired Mike Tice, who, by the way, Mike was a wonderful football character. He was in Atlanta for a while. Matt,
I like Mike, and Nate Tice, right?
Yeah, Nate's a good kid, and he's a very good content creator, a very nice guy as well. Great follow on Twitter, and so the Vikings fired Mike Tice on basically they handed the teams, every player on the team, a piece of paper when they beat the Chicago Bears in Week 17, and they finished 9-7, but they already had made the decision to fire Mike. They handed people pieces of paper on their way into the locker room from that game, right? And so that was a tumultuous thing, right? And Minnesota's a market, like I just spent the last month there, spending time with my parents. It's cold. It's not, I like it a lot, but it's not necessarily the greatest place, for everybody. So you also have to pay more in that respect. And Brad Childress, who had been Andy Reid's offensive coordinator for a number of years, 4 straight NFC title games and a Super Bowl, was on the market. And the Vikings interviewed him first, and they were so afraid that he would go to Green Bay and take the Packers job that they gave him too much, and they gave him too much power. And ultimately, Brad ended up turning it around a little bit. But even then, to try to justify that deal, they gave him another deal that was humongous. And 10 games into his second contract, they fired him. And again, they were on the hook. And Brad, to his credit, went and sipped Mai Tais for a year just to collect, as opposed to, getting another job and getting the offset. And it's just the mistakes that these teams make are tens of millions of dollars at the position, because it cuts both ways. No salary cap and guaranteed money.
So let's do this. Let's pull back a little bit and let's start from the beginning. Let's educate everyone on the 101 element of hiring a head coach, with a general manager in place. It could be the other way around, of course. Here we are with Mike Vrabel, who are trying to hire a GM. But let's more just focus on the GM in place and hiring a head coach, right? The basics of all this are there are so many things to consider. You and I have been talking about this, in the spirit of how we could continue to parlay this into our own business, which we know and think strongly can be really, really beneficial to the league. And that's having an analytic approach, and also having the subjective approach that we think that we could sort of map together in a very creative way without getting in a ton of detail, and present to ownership and a GM and ownership to present what we might think is the sort of the best case scenario for that organization. So we've talked a lot about it being focused on roster optimization, which is true, but this has been something that's been in my craw quite a bit, because you have to make sure, as a general manager, as an owner, as a president, that you're putting the right team together. And it's not just the head coach. Yes, it is a head coach, but it is also the coordinators, adept coordinators, as well as adept position coaches. When you start this whole process, sitting down with the owner, oftentimes the president, you have to decide as a group, that threesome, how you're going to build your search group. Very, very important. Some teams, it's completely narrowed down to the GM and maybe the ownership group, maybe the owner and the owner's wife or the sons, depending, but it's really small. There are others. When we were in Atlanta, when we were hiring Dan Quinn, we had, I say, 12 people. We had a big group. That was very different than when we were hiring Mike Smith. We expanded it. So it depends on how the approach is going to be, and what personally I think the ownership does when they step back and they realize, okay, the next time we hire a head coach, where have we come up short, and where do we need to expand to make sure that we are crossing our T's and dotting our I's? So,
And again, Thomas, where do you ever worry that sometimes you're overfitting in that sense? Because I've seen teams, for example, like they fall into the category of doing the exact opposite of their last coach with their new coach, right? So you go Brad Childress, Leslie Frazier, Mike Zimmer, Kevin O'Connell. You go hard ass, nice guy, hard ass, nice guy. And like, is that, do you wonder if maybe you're erring in that way?
There's no question that happens. I mean, it's just human nature, right? You've just spent 4 or 5 or 6 years, hopefully not 1 or 2, but you've spent a handful of years. And as a team builder, as the GM that survived, and the owner and the president, let's call it the way it is. You're at a spot where you're like, take a deep breath. Let's have some freshness about it. Let's go from Mike Smith, who in my situation was a really good coach. I've said that time and again. Mike Smith is very different than Dan Quinn. So it was a sort of a dichotomous hire. It was good because at times you need to adjust. You need to adjust not only the energy, the approach. That's really, really important. So when you start looking at this, again, very important is making sure that you have the selection group set up properly. You can obfuscate the process, so to speak, if you have too many people, in my mind. And you can also short sell it, in my own mind, if you have 1 or 2 or 3 people and you really haven't expanded your view. So there's a nice fine line there. Really, really important. We'll go and I'll come back to it, but that's the start, making sure that you have the right people. Understand this. I have a strong feeling about this. There are some great presidents out there, of course. There are also people out there who will join the owner's search group. Remember this. They have to make sure that they have the right motives in place, not just for survival, making sure that that president, making sure that the cap guy who might be involved, the GM himself, some of the personnel people, there's a lot of people involved there, and they have their own ulterior motives to survive. Yeah. The owner needs to know, plain and simple, let's make sure everyone's raising their hand for the right person, for the betterment of this organization, not for their own survival. And that is really, really big and very, very important.
Well, and I think that's where quantitative analysis can really help, right? Because, I think, and I'm going to be very raw here and say, I don't think quantitative analysis can do the whole job. But I do think it can. I do think it can sniff out some things, right? So if you're somebody in the building and you're pounding the table for your guy, and that guy isn't qualified, or that guy isn't necessarily fit for the job, he's not a great, all these things, but there's a couple factions in the room that politically want him there for various reasons, and we've seen this happen a number of times. An analytical approach can say, look, we know that the numbers aren't going to completely dictate who we're hiring here, but you're suggesting we take a 3 out of 10, or in your scale, 3.5 out of 9, while there's 5 guys who are 6.5s here. Come on. Like, and at least it will get the conversation maybe in the right direction and look at alternatives. And again, we don't want to dismiss the human element of it. People don't know, like, maybe people know this, but when I was in college, I played for 3 head coaches. My first year, I started with a guy who had been there for 30 years, and he was on his last leg, and then he resigned. Then we hired a guy. We went through the whole search. Then we had, then he resigned to be an AD. Then we got an associate or an interim guy who had our best season in the college in like 10 years when he was the coach. So all the players wanted him to stay as permanent. He had a number, and hopefully he's not listening to this. He had a number of like character concerns that ultimately, when he became the full-time head coach, it caused his demise, right? And so all the players were like, hey, we want this guy. We just had an above 500 season. We almost made a bowl, all this kind of stuff. And yet a rigorous process probably would have eliminated him and probably would have saved the university some angst and stuff like that. And we're the players. And like, again, we're probably not equipped to hire a head coach. And yet, like, there's a room of people who are going to have a little more gumption and are going to come at it with a little bit more strength. And if that guy is not the right guy for your team, you have to have reasons, either mathematical or, when you talk about personality tests or scouting evals of the coach, you need to have reasons for that.
So one of the things that most people don't know about this, in the early stages of Sumer Sports, we pulled in almost 50 former head coaches, some of the best minds, former head coaches, coordinators, position coaches, personnel men, GMs, and we had ideation pods, and we talked about everything under the sun, not only the metric trees per position, which was very, very important. We segued into conversation about coaching, about next steps in coaching, hiring coaches. We tapped into some unbelievable knowledge, some of the best minds over the last, 50, 60, 100 years of football. We feel very strong. Thank God that we had Paul Tudor Jones willing to spend the money on it. We spent a lot. We've done that a lot, just so everyone knows. We continue to tap into our GM focus groups. Won't get into details of who they are, as well as coaches who can really provide us with the right information as we are growing. Of course, I have a ton of experience, humbly, having been in this league for 30 plus years in football and 28 in this league. And, you having a really strong, one of the strongest analytic minds, in the country, in the world, per football, for sure, per sport. And we're able to really tap into this and understand hiring a coach is a really complicated venture. And there are many levels to it. It's not just how people are calling the plays, as I mentioned earlier. There are subjective elements, and you have to have a decision amongst your search group, your owner mainly, and your general manager, to decide what you're truly looking for. If you don't, what continues to come out in all of our discussion with our GM focus groups is we're talking about some of the subjective elements. We're talking about leadership. We're talking about communication. We're talking about adaptability. We're talking about pure intelligence as it pertains to football. And then we're talking about a lot of other quantifiable elements that aren't as subjective, which are vital. How you weight all of those elements are really, really important in my mind as a former GM that has been around a number of great coaches. I'll go all the way back to my early years with Wayne Fontes and Bobby Ross in Detroit, to Butch
Wayne
Davis.
Fontes, a personal favorite of mine. Yeah. The starter jacket, unlike the starter jacket, is first ballot Hall of Fame coach attire. Wayne Fontes in the Silverdome, amazing guy.
Well, that's exactly right. I think about those guys, right? Again, to Bobby Rice, to Wayne Fontes, to Butch Davis, to Bill Belichick, of course, to being around Mike Smith, and also, of course, Dan Quinn. I mean, all really, really interesting coaches, very, very different. So I can tap into that knowledge. But what I understand from year to year and the evolution of the league, things have changed. What we are looking for in head coaches now is very different in today's world than it was 10, 15, or 20 years ago. That's why even more amazing that a guy like Bill Belichick can settle in like he is, the best ever. People have their opinions, of course, because they may not like his personality or don't buy into whatever. He is the best ever, hands down, in my mind. So having an opportunity to be around that is important. But look, when you start digging into trying to decide on who's going to be the best coach for you as a general manager, and all you rising executives, this needs to be discussed a lot more. And I want to fold into some of these other areas that we can talk about that I know you can bring up as we're.
Yeah, I think that's really where you really have to decide where your team is too, right? Because I think of all the things you can quantify, and I did this at I presented this at this Carnegie Mellon conference in 2018. You can literally just measure play calling ability by taking grades, and again, they can be Pro Football Focus grades, they can be Sports Info Solutions grades, it can be Paul Saban's plus minus that he did for ESPN. You can do any grading system and say, okay, how would an average coach perform in this situation? And then you can look at the delta and say, okay, that's good coaching, right? Now, there's a number of different things that can go into that. But ultimately, if you do it that way, the best coaches stack, right? You've seen, our internal dashboards where I look historically at the metrics, and it's Andy Reid, it's, Bill Belichick, it's John Harbaugh, it's all Mike Tomlin, all the great coaches do all. Look at Mike Tomlin. That, and I've been very, very politically correct on this show, but I'm going to be a little bit politically incorrect. The roster for the Steelers isn't very good, and they won 9 games. Like, that is a great coach, right? We talk about the Titans, and I don't even think the Titans roster is necessarily that bad. They're just all injured, and that team is playing for their division every year. That's a good coach, right? Like, we look and, and this is another thing for people who aren't necessarily mathematically oriented. This is how a mathematician thinks, where I'm listening to you, Thomas, and I'm listening to people who are of your caliber and of your orientation talk about what makes a good X, and then I go back to the computer and try to code it up. And I, that's basically. So when I think about, when you say, okay, who's a great coach? What does a great coach do? You're like, well, can he develop players? Well, I might not be perfect, but I can go back and look and see, okay, well, player X is age 27. We would expect a player of age 27 to be this good in age 28. Oh, wow. That coach makes that player above and beyond that expectation every year, right? So that guy's a good, developer. Now, can that perfectly encapsulate everything? Of course not. If a guy gets hurt, right, then he's going to grade worse in all likelihood, and maybe then I'm missing something there. But if you build a sample over a large set of coaches, you're going to win 55% of coaching hires when the rest of the league is winning 50. You're going to win 60 when the rest of the league is winning 50. And so those are the kind of things you look at. And I know Zach Rogers was talking here about coaching decisions and building a simulation. By the way, Zach, one of the more brilliant people in the public sports analytics space. I hope everybody looks at his Big Data Bowl submission recently. But it's fourth down decisions too. Like, you look at Dan Campbell, and everybody talks about how inspirational he is and how awesome he is, right? But the guy also goes for all the right fourth downs. And those two things are correlated, right? If you tell Jared Goff, a mediocre quarterback for most of his career, hey, I believe in you, maybe he's going to get better. Like, that's, and maybe that's contributing to development. And so it's hard to mash all those things together, but I think with a large enough sample, you can get an idea of what guys are pushing the right buttons. And then after that, it's up to, the people that are paid the real big bucks, the GMs and stuff, to make that decision about, okay, let's break a tie between two guys who the math like equally.
Oh, look, we had a great conversation this morning with you, me, and of course, Sean Clement. I thought it was fascinating. You guys could tell we're getting a little bit agitated, not with me, but just the concept of it's not that complicated. What happens with a lot of old school football people, not even old school football people, most of the football people in today's world need to continue to be educated. Do they have the brain to be educated? No question. Do they have the time? Do they have the focus? Unfortunately, they don't. They need a company like Sumer Sports to come in my opinion, with a big brain data scientist like yourself. Humbly, someone like myself that has sat in the seat and has been around football for 30 plus years, to be able to describe the importance of combining not only the analytical elements, but also the subjective. Let me do this, because this is really important. Bear with me for a second. I know. So we reached out to well over 10 former GMs and current GMs that I know very well. And of course, I have relationships with virtually everyone in the league this way. And we wanted to put together a metric tree that was suitable for this search time, right? In the head coach time. bear with me. I'm going to go through them. I'm going to go a little bit quick, and we don't have to talk about them all, but note which ones in your mind are quantifiable and which ones aren't. And the order that we have these in right now, everyone, you'll find it very interesting, because these are the orders that we, with obviously differences between different people, we settled on. This is fascinating to me. Okay, let's start. Number 1, leadership. Number 2, communication. Number 3, intelligence. Number 4, culture builder. Number 5, adaptability. Number 6, evaluation prowess. Of course, we know what that is. Play calling, number 7. On-field ability, 8. Scheme ability, 9. Discipline, 10. 11, development. 12, in the meeting room. 13, game planning. 14, relationships. And 15, substitution. Don't get me started on substitution, by the way.
I know, like this is, and I think we're gonna, we might have to enlist the great Adam Vonderhaar, formerly of Dallas, now with us, who has done great work in that realm. There are some of those things that you can't, like, I think leadership is difficult to quantify, right? I think culture builder is one where I think you can actually probably, and I actually had a conversation about this with the GM in the league the other day, which was like, I wish I had data on the trades and the free agent signings that didn't happen, because I do think you can suss out culture building by your ability to sign free agents above and beyond your, like, what their market rate would have been. So I take like Zadarius Smith, for example, who went to Minnesota, and I think that like there was an aspect of like, I want to go play with Eric Hendricks, I want to go play with Harrison Smith, I want to go play in a place with all these veterans who have built a great culture in Minnesota on the defensive side of the ball. And there might be other places where players don't want to go, right? And you could probably, through transactional data, suss that out. But that one's more on the side of, you probably have to get into that locker room and walk around and be like, when I was going to grad school, when I was being recruited to go to grad school, a woman came up to me during my trip, and she goes, all you need to know about this place, Eric, is all the grad students are happy. And like, I think like the part of football is like, you kind of want to go in and be like, hey, all the people here are happy, right? Like and that's hard to quantify.
So can I interject quickly before you go, just very quickly? So when we're talking about the 1 to 5, leadership all the way down to adaptability, and let's just say hypothetically, we say those are difficult to quantify, not impossible. I would suggest to everyone, here's my own little deal here. We can't pay you, of course, but I'd be really interested to see if anyone has any really hot ideas of how you would truly quantify leadership, communication, intelligence, culture building, and adaptability.
Which, by the way, just to interrupt, we hope eventually to have a content place on our Sumer Sports website. What we would like to do on a future episode would be what Thomas has listed out, have that be a part of the show notes, and have obviously turn comments onto the website. We would love for sumersports.com to be a place for that, and we anticipate it being such. We are finishing up some of our B2B products before we get to that, but that is certainly part of the vision. And again, there are a bunch of great ideas here. I mean, the fact of the matter is, like, I like this one right here from Mojal, who has been a very loyal listener. The Jags have overpaid for free agents this year to change the culture. Like, and Doug Peterson has also changed the culture a little bit too. But like, these are things where, math isn't made by just throwing the data into a machine. You have to have hypotheses. You have to have, and maybe there's a hypothesis here where essentially, like, we go in and say, okay, what are the traits? Just like you're, scouting players, what are the traits of a good culture? Can we find data to help us see if we can discern from that, and so on and so forth?
Mojo, just very quickly, Mojo, I 100% agree. I don't know how many times we did that, especially through Atlanta, when we went out and we made sure that we were acquiring the right free agent or not, or getting rid of someone on our team. We had this discussion the other day in our on-site, right? Where we had the discussion where, you'll never or rarely are you going to see a top-notch free agent from an organization leave unless, call it the way it is, he is a, what's the right word?
Yeah, he's a prick, right?
If he's a prick.
And even prick, like I would keep pricks on my football team. It's a step beyond that.
Well, you would keep a prick, but if your prick on the team ends up turning, I've always believed, and Bill Belichick was wonderful in this, he could have 3 or 4 wayward souls or 1 or 2. But if you end up having 6, 7, or 8, and your pillar players become that, it is a no-brainer. It ends up tearing your building apart. So when people make comments like you might have made comments before towards me, I don't know if I really would have done that, parlayed that. Owner in your ear, everyone understand this, and a head coach who's saying, we need to sign Julio Jones to a 3rd contract for many, many reasons. It's not just how he is in the locker room. It could be, again, you've heard me say this, it could be how many damn jerseys he's selling or whatever tickets he's selling. I mean, those are other things to consider. That a lot of times you think, oh, you don't think about that. You do think about that. The culture is a big, big thing. And how you quantify that is going to be interesting. Just how you quantify some of these other top 5s that are really interesting in that list.
Yeah. By the way, there was a great question here by a gentleman called Jim Monk in the comments who said, is there a position for a person who can bridge the gap between analytics and coaching in football? Now, there are some people. Daniel Stern of the Ravens is a coach who is an analytics person. So these have already happened. He's the one who got I think he had a Good Morning Football segment about him and with Harbaugh's 4th down decisions. The pioneer in this has been Dean Oliver, though, who is a basketball coach for the Washington Wizards, who prior to that created a book called Basketball on Paper, one of the premier analysts, but again, to gain a little bit more of a foothold. I personally believe, and this is where I think maybe I'm different than a lot of analytics people, is I believe that I need to be above replacement in everything else about football if I'm going to ever make any progress within football. So like my hope is, like, if Thomas said, hey, Eric, we're doing the Sumer Sports Show today and you can't talk about math. Like, my hope would be to be a better than practice squad player in this podcast. Like, that's my hope. So I want to know enough about football to be able to bullshit with Thomas about football and at least not embarrass myself. And I think my goal as somebody who mentors people in sports analytics, like that is my goal. So I want the statisticians that work for me to be that way with respect to football, and the people I work with, like Thomas, like you and I are working. So like if I start a podcast, let's say in 3 months, and I'm like, Thomas, you can't talk football. You guys got to talk math. Like we're going to have an above replacement level show. That I think is the goal, right? Because then they're football teams in every sense of the word, right? Like I want a future where you hire a coach and no one says, well, that was a scouting hire or that was a front office hire. That's an analytics hire. It's a football team hire. And I think that most places operate that way because there's not as much analytics there. I want a team that has a fair amount of analytics, but all the analytics people are football people at heart in a very real way. And not because they start out that way like I did, but more like because we have gone out of our way to bring them into the community that way.
This is one of the things that you had mentioned earlier as well, in and around what you're saying. What GMs do not oftentimes, or it takes a while for them to get a second opportunity, right? Whereas head coaches, because owners are trying to contrast what they had in the building much more than the GM, right? They could have the same type of GM for years, so it's not as big of a deal. On the coaching side, it is. You have a hard ass, you have a guy who's more of a player's person, and you can go in that direction. A GM is not, a hard ass, and all of a sudden you want a guy who's going to be smooth sailing and everything like the piece of driftwood. So that's one thing I wanted to mention here. Another thing that is really important as we're talking, oftentimes when you start getting into the recruiting of this, right? Remember, limited resources. We can have all these names that people list, and there's 10, 15, 20 coordinators out there. But the reality is there aren't 20 head coaches that are going to vie for these 3, 4, or 5 positions, right? It's really, really narrowed down. What happens is if it really gets down to the top people, and Arthur Blank was like this, these guys are like this as owners, right? They are competitive dudes, man.
Yeah.
Again, I've said train set. I've also said they are not backing down to their brethren in the league. So they get recruiting. It sounds odd, right? They get recruiting the potential head coaches. It got down to Dan Quinn. Everyone in the country wanted Dan Quinn back in 15. We went round and round about it. What ended up happening here, everyone needs to know this. What we call in the league, and some people probably do know this, there's that coach or that GM has 53. Final 53 is basically final football say. It's a really important part of this. If your head coach is hired to have final 53, it takes away an element of power from the general manager. Some are comfortable with it, some aren't. Some are recruited that way. Mike Smith and I'll be completely honest. Mike Smith and I, for those first 7 years, I had final football say. We worked marvelously together. We were always together. We were not, it wasn't an ego thing who had what, but someone had to have final 53. When that last linebacker on the roster was there, it had to go to the head coach of the GM. This is a negotiation point in the NFL. With Dan Quinn, when Dan came, Dan didn't want 53, interestingly enough. Dan wanted to come in and he wanted to coach. In the end, we were in the middle of recruiting, of course. And Arthur, all due respect to Arthur and Dan, they came out of the final meeting. Dan came to me and said, T, I got 53. Arthur really wants me to take 53. We'll work together on everything. And Dan and I are never at loggerheads. That's not a bad thing at all. Meaning we work together really, really well. But Dan had final 53 within that building. So it's complicated. How an owner wants to approach it is very, very important. It's what I would say if we were ever in a consultant role. Honestly, Eric, I would sit down with the owner and say, what truly are you looking for from this person? Because it can go in completely different direction depending on who has 53 and the egos of the two people who might be vying for that 53 position.
Yeah, especially when you have staggered hirings and firings, right? Like where, you look at Carolina where they hired Rule first and then Fitterer later, like then they fire Rule and now Fitterer like might have to grow into a different role than he had with Rule there. And like that maybe wasn't part of the assumption space when that hire happened. It's so interesting. A few of the ones that we have, by the way, there's a really good question in the chat that I want to get to. And one question from Twitter that I want to get to before we close up here. I know it's Thursday night and we gotta spend time with our families here, but scheme is something that we've done a lot of work when I was at Pro Football Focus and now we've done at Sumer. Like I do think that you can model scheme and adaptability basically being the derivative of scheme. How much do you let scheme change when the league changes? So those are things you can model. And I do think, again, I think that's one where math is maybe better suited to measure those things than the human eye is. But again, like we've done a little bit of work. Play calling is another one. Decision making, like Zach had a great question in the chat about could you put like a coach through a test at the beginning of the hiring process, say, hey, like I saw, like be still my heart. Dan Campbell the other day, the Packers, it was 2nd and 1, and the Lions were trying to run the clock out. And the Packers did the smart thing. The Packers have some really sharp people in the building. And the Packers jumped off sides on purpose, right? The reason you would do that is so that you can reset the clock to 1st and 10, and then you need to get 3 stops, and you get 3 runs of the clock, as opposed to if it's 2nd and 1, you have as many as 5 stops you have to get. And so they jump off sides, which good decision for them. Dan Campbell is the first coach I've ever seen decline the offsides and decline the automatic first down. And I was like, if I was ever hiring a coach, I would ask him what he or she was doing in that moment. Like, I'd be like, because I can understand wanting the first down, but take me through your thought process here. And like just going through, and this is why it's so important that like you and I are football junkies. We've watched every game that's ever been played. Basically, you see the role, you have that Rolodex. You watch that and you're like, I've never seen that before. That's cool. That guy knows how to think on the fly. And it was so edifying there. One question that I think rounds out this podcast really well, and this is by Ashley Prue. She says, there are several college coaches who have struggled in the NFL. Do you think it's because of those subjective elements, or are there quantifiable elements they do not have experience with in college?
I have some strong opinions about this. You want to lead in on the quantifiable side, and I'll banter more
Yeah, I think that what wins as a college football coach is just totally different than what wins in the NFL. I think I might have said this on air, but like my college offensive line coach, when I asked him if he wanted to coach Division I, he said no because I like that you all suck, and that makes my coaching more important. Whereas if I coached for Alabama, it wouldn't matter. My coaching wouldn't matter that much because you all are good and they're all bad. Recruiting is such a huge aspect of college football, and in some ways, the constraints that you have are so magnificent that you can either or so limited, right? Like that your coaching decisions often don't cover that. Whereas in the NFL, the talent disparity between your 2007 New England Patriots and the 2008 Detroit Lions is big, but not nearly as big as like Vanderbilt versus Alabama. And so there's that part where coaching's more important. The on-field stuff's more important. And then furthermore, almost every NFL game has a moment like the Dan Campbell moment that I just talked about, where you really have to make a decision that influences the win probability of the game a lot. And in college football, you play 12, 13 games a year, and 8 of them are blowouts. And so you don't get as many on-field mental reps of the close games and like the pivot points of a football game. So I just don't know if coaching college prepares you as well for the NFL as doing college anything else prepares you for anything else.
Great way to articulate that. And I would say there are some unbelievable football coaches who have tried, and it just is so few and far between all the way back. We could go on and on. I don't need to list them all. We all know who they are. And it's kind of sad because they are really good football people. In the end, there's a money issue, right? We saw what happened in Jacksonville with Urban Meyer. He just could not get it going with a group. When you're dealing with egos and you're dealing with the money, completely different. It's honestly one of the issues that is, there are some really good football coaches in the Canadian Football League. You and I've talked about this.
Yep.
I don't know what that transition is like to go from being a top-notch head football coach in the CFL to come here and deal with the money and the egos. A guy like Mike O'Shea for the Winnipeg Blue Bombers, he is a damn good football coach. I'm a big supporter of his. He went to the University of Guelph. I think he should get a shot, but I don't think there are many people that will.
He also, by the way, has a first ballot Hall of Fame beard.
He has a first ballot Hall of Fame, and he played for 15 years. He's just, but so what I am saying here too, though, is that is such a tough move to come from college back into the pro. Now, there are guys. I'm a big fan of James Franklin. I think James Franklin is a really good football coach. Those people who have coached in the NFL, gone back to college, even those guys, I'm sure James Franklin, as good as he is, I'm not answering for him, would say like, wow, I feel like I got a really good handle on Penn State and what he's doing there. But that's got to be a little unnerving thinking someone's going to come here, throw all this money at me, and I'm going to have to go back into the NFL after that many years away from it. Things change. They're changing fast. I just don't know in the very end, when you're a head coach, and I've said this time and again, in the college ranks, you are the dude. Remember, everyone, yeah, you have a president. The president's down the hall or down the hallway or wherever, down the street. I get it. The AD has no say over you as the head coach. You're the
highest paid public employee in most states.
And then when you come into the world and you have to coexist side by side, even given away, again, what I said earlier, final football say to a GM, that's a big ego blow. Yep. And it's not easy to deal with. And then, so many, many times, a lot of these college coaches that come in to work in this space in the NFL, they just lose grasp. And before you know it, they get pissed, and there's all kinds of turmoil going on. And then all of what you're measuring that you think is so great about that guy, Chip Kelly is a really smart football coach, but it went awry with he and Howie Roseman, and it ended up just completely diving.
Well, and you see it with the NIL stuff because you see where coaches are a little nervous about players getting power, right? And not because they don't. I don't think that these guys are like super, I don't think they're bad people for this. I think it's more of, and you see it, and we talk about this in business all the time. Like when you're working with great people, you have to understand how to manage right? And management cannot just be, it cannot just be, I'm God and you're not. Like that cannot. And like, I feel like for a lot of college coaches, that is the orientation. Now, you got in my feels a little bit because Mark Trestman, another Minnesota State graduate like myself, I really wanted to root for him, A, because I love the CFL, and B, because I wanted to see another Dragon do well in the NFL. But you could tell that he lost that locker room. But Mark's a really nice guy.
I love
Amazing
Mark.
guy.
I think Mark is brilliant.
And a Super Bowl quarterback coach, offensive coordinator, like a brilliant football mind, a many-time Grey Cup over guy. But he didn't get that much of a chance, and it got away from him quickly. The one guy that I think, and maybe this is the model, and maybe that's why it's such a crappy model, but this is the model, I think. Pete Carroll was, a long time NFL coach, Vikings, Jets, got his one trip played for the Jets in 94. They start 6-5. They lose their last 5 games. He gets fired in 1 year. He goes to New England right away after that, does the silly little, I don't shop groceries thing. He does okay in New England, not terribly. They still go, let him go. Bill Belichick gets the job. He goes to USC. He tastes some success. He takes all the right things from college, namely how to generate confidence for himself, how to develop people. But I think that the Carroll thing, and if you've ever been in the Seattle, facility, there are books about, Angela Duckworth's work, and there's books that, the growth mindset thing, knowing that you are not a fixed entity, knowing that in different scenarios you have to be a different person sometimes, it to me is like the only way. And now Carroll's had a great year, by the way, but like I think you have to have that growth mindset of like constantly learning, constantly adapting, and that to me is how Pete Carroll has had NFL success. But it was through failure in the NFL and success in college that I think he learned how to have success in the NFL. Drafting Russell Wilson in round 3 also helps.
Well, and he has a really good guy and a guy that's going to work with him with John Schneider. And John knows the line there, and they both know it and respect each other. It was great to see what they did this year, meaning with Geno. I mean, it was really cool to step back and look at it. Before I toss it back to you, because you're finishing up like you always do, I want to say this, because we finally got some merchandise in. Back to my plea for some ideas on analytical approaches to the subjective elements. It is a hat and a T-shirt for the best one. These are the top 3, and this is our judgment. Hat and a T-shirt for number 2 and number 3. A hat or a T-shirt. Just so we need to start getting this merch out, man. We need to start.
Exactly. So are we suggesting go to @Sumer on Twitter, give us your best 3 subjective and objective, and the winners will be chosen on Monday's show?
We are suggesting, I personally go to those top 5, go back and listen. Is it in our show notes or no?
Yeah. Well, I can put them in the YouTube show notes.
Okay. I'm concerned about those because those are the top 5 that our group, and I continue to talk about it, they're the least quantifiable, at least according to us. How do we, let's start digging in and see if we can find a way to
so a T-shirt and a hat for the 3 most quantifiable and the 3 least quantifiable. Okay, I like that a lot. Okay, the last one I want to talk about, the last question, and this one is because this man is an OG in football analytics. The Big Data Bowl is just closing up. But it's also because the NFL is debuting for the first time the fact that overtime in the NFL is not sudden death anymore, not completely. As folks know, each team gets a chance to score a touchdown if they want to in the playoffs. Michael Lopez at Stats by Lopez, the director of data and analytics at the NFL, I think he's executive director now. He says, episode 20 question: what rules change would you make and why? I gave this to you. We had a day to think about this. I'm interested to see what you say.
Well, again, it is overtime, and I am just not a fan of sudden death. I really am not. So look, that's where I'd go with it. And I know you have a strong opinion about it, so I don't want to let. Why don't you rhyme off?
And I know Mike doesn't agree with this because he actually wrote a really cool article in Sports Illustrated a long time ago about what happened when the NHL started making overtime ties basically if you got to overtime, you got a point, and it showed teams slow down at the end. I'm more in favor of having ties in the NFL after regulation in the regular season than I am with the current overtime. I think we should just play 1 quarter of a predetermined length, and whoever wins that quarter wins the game in both, regular season and NFL. And if it's a tie after that in the regular season, make it a tie. And in overtime, you just keep playing until so basically you keep playing quarters until after a quarter the game's over. Like a team has more points than the other team. That is what I do. I understand there's player health issues and things like that. Those I think statistically aren't as big of a deal as before. But yeah, that is what I would go with. I would also, by the way, this is the one rule I would change in the NFL, and I wonder what your thoughts are on this. I would make rookie contracts either shorter or longer.
Okay.
I would make them either 2 years or 6 years.
Let's okay. That's very interesting.
I think 4 years is too weird of a window in the NFL.
It's weird. Yeah.
Because linemen mature too slowly, and so you don't draft enough linemen, and the quality of play is lower. And some positions do so well from the get-go, like Justin Jefferson, that I'd either want it so that you could extend him you have to extend him after 2 years or not. But like I think 4 years is the wrong window for a rookie contract length. And so I would either make it 2 and make it like bidding after 2 years, or I would make it 6 like baseball and basically back kind of to the 80s. But then it makes team building that much more important. It makes the draft that much more important because you can't just churn and burn picks because you have those guys for 6 years.
Of course. I do want to step back for a second to the tie thing that you talk about. Why not go to the tie thing? What has been the discussion out there about, okay, we go to the tie, it's a tie, but let's have a shoot off. And let's go out there and go receiver against defensive back and quarterback and truly one play and see who wins it.
Well, the USFL did that in the spring, right? So they basically had 2-point conversion back and forth, which I actually don't hate that. It's just, it's really difficult to determine a fair outcome, but I don't mind that at all. And in fact, it makes the stats better, of course, right? Because you're not going to generate that many more yards. And for sports betting and stuff, you were talking about props and over-unders and stuff, the 2-point conversion back and forth doesn't actually hurt those numbers that much. So I don't hate that at all. The New Orleans Breakers won a game in the USFL this spring via overtime, and it was actually quite fun. I think that was Sam Schwartzstein's idea when they ran the XFL back in 2020, but that got shortened by the pandemic. So there's football is so much fun. And I said this when we were talking yesterday, and I want to end with this. What I love so much about football is innovations make it more exciting. And the more that they innovate, the more that we're going to have to work, which means we'll always have something to do. So I really am excited about that. So thank you all for joining us. Thomas, thanks for staying a little longer today with everything, but really appreciate you all coming. At Sumer Sports on Twitter for links to the show notes and all that kind of stuff. And obviously at Sumer Sports on YouTube if you want to subscribe. We're almost up to 500 subscribers. So for Thomas Dimitroff, this is Eric Eager. This has been episode 20 of the Sumer Sports Show.